Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something catastrophic. A story of royal blood, shattered crowns, and a woman who refused to let her family's murders go unavenged. We're talking about Margaret of York, a princess who became the most dangerous enemy the Tudor dynasty ever faced. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In 1503, a woman lay dying in Mechlin, her fingers still clutching letters that could topple a kingdom. She'd spent 23 years plotting revenge against the man who murdered her brothers. 23 years sending assassins, funding rebellions, creating false princes from peasant boys. Margaret of York had outlived 2 dynasties, 3 husbands worth of politics, and every enemy except the one that mattered. Even on her deathbed, servants found her dictating one last letter, one final attempt to destroy Henry Tudor. The man who'd stolen her family's throne was still breathing, and that fact was killing her faster than any disease could. But what Henry didn't know, what would haunt him until his own paranoid death, was that Margaret had already set something in motion, something that would make him question every face in his court, every shadow in his palace, every son he'd ever trust with his stolen crown. You need to understand something about being born a York woman in 1446. You weren't born into luxury. You were born into leverage, a breathing, bleeding political contract waiting to be signed. Margaret entered the world at Fotheringhay Castle on May 3rd, the youngest daughter who would survive to adulthood, and from that first breath, she was currency. Her father, Richard, Duke of York, didn't see a daughter. He saw an alliance waiting to happen, a treaty wrapped in baby clothes. Her mother, Cecily Neville, they called her the Rose of Raby, was so beautiful that people whispered she must be sleeping with archers to birth such tall sons. But Cecily wasn't just beautiful, she was vicious, the kind of mother who taught her daughters that marriage was warfare by other means. That love was a luxury they couldn't afford. That survival meant becoming too valuable to kill and too dangerous to ignore. Margaret was the 6th surviving child, born into a nursery that was really a battlefield strategy meeting. Her older brothers, Edward and Edmund, were already being groomed for war. George was still in swaddling clothes, but already showing signs of the spectacular stupidity that would define his life. And baby Richard wouldn't arrive for another 6 years. Richard, who'd grow up to either save or destroy everything they built, depending on which history you believed. The castle at Fotheringhay wasn't just stone and mortar. It was a fortress of ambition. Every room held conspirators. Every meal was a war council. Every prayer was a plea for their enemy's destruction. Margaret learned to walk in halls where men planned murders between morning prayers. She learned to talk while listening to her mother encode treason in embroidery instructions. She learned to read from books that traced her family's claim to the throne, through bloodlines that mattered more than gospel. Here's what made her different from the start. While her brothers played with wooden swords, Margaret played with information. She'd sit in corners during adult conversations, so quiet they'd forget she was there, memorizing every word. She knew which servants could be trusted with messages, which priests reported to which nobles, which merchants were really spies. By age 7, she had what her mother called the gift of useful silence, the ability to be present but invisible, to hear everything while appearing to understand nothing. See, her father, Richard, Duke of York, wasn't just ambitious. He had a legitimate claim to the throne that was arguably better than King Henry VI. The Lancastrian line came through a usurper, Henry IV, who'd stolen the crown from Richard II. The York claim came through an older line, purer blood, better rights. It was the kind of legal argument that could be settled with documents or with swords, and everyone knew which one it would be. King Henry VI was the perfect enemy because he was the worst possible king. He'd inherited the throne as a baby, grew up weak and pliable, then lost his mind completely. He'd fall into catatonic states that lasted months. He'd forget his own name, his wife's face, his son's existence. He once spent 18 months believing he was made of glass and would shatter if anyone touched him. The court had to conduct business around a king who sat frozen in terror of his own imaginary fragility. While Henry cowered from invisible threats, his wife Margaret of Anjou ruled in his name. They called her the she-wolf of France, and she earned it. She was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely devoted to keeping her son's inheritance intact, which meant destroying the Yorks before they could destroy her. The two Margarets, Anjou and York, would spend their lives as inverse mirrors of each other, both strong women navigating weak men's wars, both believers that mercy was just delayed defeat, both willing to do whatever it took to see their enemies bleed. Baby Margaret's first clear memory wasn't of toys or treats. It was of her mother burning letters in the middle of the night, the smell of scorching parchment, the sound of Cecily whispering, "Not yet, not yet," as she fed another secret to the flames. Margaret stood in her night shift, watching her mother destroy evidence of something that could get them all killed, and learned her first real lesson. Words could be weapons, but only if your enemies found them. By age 9, Margaret's education was deliberately split. In public, she learned what a noble daughter should: dancing, music, languages, scripture, how to manage a household, how to embroider lies as smoothly as silk, how to curtsy to men who wanted her family dead, while smiling like she didn't know about the assassination attempts they'd funded. In private, her mother taught her different lessons: how to read account books and find the hidden expenses that meant someone was stealing, how to recognize poison by smell. Almonds meant arsenic, garlic meant phosphorus, no smell at all meant you were already dead. How to hide gold in dress hems and messages in prayer books. How to make men think you were weak while planning their destruction. The lesson that stuck most came when Margaret was 10. A servant girl was caught carrying messages for the Lancastrians. Cecily had her brought to the solar where Margaret was practicing her needlework. The girl was maybe 16, pretty, trembling. Cecily asked Margaret what should be done with a traitor. Margaret suggested mercy. The girl was young, scared, maybe she didn't understand. Cecily nodded thoughtfully. Then she had the girl's tongue cut out right there in the solar. The blood splattered across Margaret's embroidery. The girl's screams turned to gurgles, then whimpers, then nothing. "Mercy," Cecily explained, cleaning blood off Margaret's cheek with a silk handkerchief, "is what you show when everyone is watching. Justice is what you do when they're not." The girl lived. Couldn't talk, obviously, but lived. Cecily kept her on as a servant, a walking reminder that the Duchess of York could destroy you and still make you serve her breakfast. Margaret saw that girl every day for the next 4 years, watched her flinch whenever Cecily spoke, watched her try to scream warnings about things she'd overheard but couldn't communicate. It was an education in the economics of cruelty. How much fear cost, what silence was worth. How to turn mercy into its own kind of torture. The Wars of the Roses didn't start with a declaration. They started with an ambush that went wrong, or right, depending on whose side you were on. In 1455, Margaret's father tried to intercept King Henry at St. Albans. It was supposed to be a negotiation enforced by armed presence. Instead, it became the first battle of a civil war that would last 30 years and kill more English nobles than the Black Death. Margaret was 9 when her father came home from St. Albans, with blood still under his fingernails and the Duke of Somerset's death on his conscience. He'd won the battle, but hadn't taken the throne. Couldn't bring himself to kill an anointed king, even a mad one. That hesitation would cost him everything, but not for a few years yet. For now, he was Lord Protector, ruling in Henry's name, while Henry drooled in a tower somewhere, convinced his own hands were made of butterfly wings. These were the years when Margaret learned what victory looked like. Spoiler, It looked exactly like defeat, just with better clothes. The Yorks controlled the government, but the Lancastrians controlled the story. Every decision her father made was portrayed as treason. Every reform was rebellion. Every attempt to stabilise the kingdom was painted as usurpation. Margaret watched her father try to rule honourably in a dishonourable game, watched him make the classic mistake of thinking good governance mattered more than good propaganda. The Queen, Margaret of Anjou, hadn't given up. She'd retreated to the Midlands, raising armies and teaching her son that the Yorks were devils in human form. She spread rumours that Cecily had slept with an archer, that all the York children were bastards, that Richard, Duke of York, practised witchcraft and drank baby's blood. The rumours were ridiculous, but they stuck, because people would rather believe an interesting lie than a boring truth, and the truth that Richard was just a competent administrator trying to govern while the actual king thought he was a tulip was definitely boring. Margaret learned to navigate this world of weaponised gossip. At 11, she attended her first royal Christmas feast. She was seated between two Lancastrian ladies who spent the entire meal describing in graphic detail what they hoped would happen to her brothers. How Edward's pretty face would look mounted on a spike. How Edmund's head would be sent to his mother in a basket. They smiled while they said it, passing her sweetmeats and patting her cheek, treating their threats like dinner conversation. Margaret smiled back, complimented their dresses, asked innocent questions about their own sons, where they lived, what they studied, who guarded them. By the end of the meal, she knew enough about their families to destroy them if needed. She was 11 years old and already playing a game most adults couldn't understand. Information was ammunition, and she was stockpiling for a war everyone knew was coming. Then came 1415, the year of endings, historians would later call it, though at the time it just felt like everything catching fire at once. King Henry had one of his lucid periods, always dangerous because he'd tried to undo everything that happened while he was mad. He declared the Yorks traitors, again, but this time he had an army to enforce it. The confrontation came at Ludford Bridge. Margaret's father brought his forces, but at the last moment, their key allies, the Calais garrison, switched sides. Betrayal in the middle of the night. The York forces evaporated like morning mist. Her father had two choices: fight and die gloriously, or flee and live shamefully. He chose life. The family scattered. Richard and Edmund fled to Ireland. Edward escaped to Calais. Cecily stayed to face the consequences with her younger children, including Margaret. What followed was the Parliament of Devils. Every York property was confiscated, every title stripped, every ally arrested or turned. Margaret, 13 years old, went from being one of the richest heiresses in England to technically being a traitor's daughter, with nothing to her name but the clothes she wore. Cecily had to beg, actually beg on her knees, for a pittance to feed her children. The Queen made her do it publicly, in front of the entire court, just for the pleasure of watching the proud Rose of Raby grovel. Margaret stood behind her mother during that humiliation, memorising every face that smiled, every noble who'd eaten at their table, now laughing at their downfall, every bishop who'd blessed them now, calling them cursed. She didn't cry, didn't rage, just watched and remembered. Years later, when she had power and money, she'd destroy each of those men so thoroughly their families would change their names to escape the association. But that day, she just stood silent, a 13-year-old girl learning that humiliation was just anger that hadn't found its weapon yet. They spent 6 months in limbo, not quite prisoners, not quite free, living on the Queen's mercy, which meant constant surveillance, periodic interrogations, and the daily possibility that today might be the day they were quietly executed. Margaret learned to sleep light, ready to run, learned to hide jewellery in her hair that could be sold for passage to Ireland, learned to smile at guards while calculating how long it would take to reach their throats with her mother's sewing scissors. Then December 1460 arrived, like divine judgment. Her father and Edmund had returned from Ireland with an army. They marched south while Edward sailed from Calais. The plan was to catch the Lancastrians in a pincer movement, trap them between two forces, end this war once and for all. Instead, they walked into catastrophe. The Battle of Wakefield wasn't just a defeat, it was deliberate humiliation. Margaret's father, Richard, Duke of York, had accepted a Christmas truce. The Lancastrians broke it, ambushed his camp, slaughtered his forces while they were half-armed and completely unprepared. Richard died fighting, which was probably how he wanted it. But Edmund, 17-year-old Edmund, barely old enough to grow a beard, was captured alive. They made him kneel on Wakefield Bridge, made him beg for his life, while the Lancastrian lords laughed. Lord Clifford, whose father had died at St Albans, personally executed him. "Your father killed mine," he said, "so now I'll kill his cubs." Edmund's last word was, "Mother." They left his body on the bridge for the crows, but that wasn't enough for them. They cut off Richard's head, crowned it with a paper crown made from a Bible's pages, and stuck it on a spike above Micklegate Bar in York. The paper crown, mockery of his royal ambitions, stayed there for weeks, rain-soaked and rotting, while his face decomposed for all to see. They put Edmund's head next to him, father and son reunited in death and degradation. The messenger who brought word to Cecily collapsed before he could finish, not from exhaustion, from fear. He knew what this woman was capable of when angry. Cecily listened to the full report in silence. Then she turned to Margaret and her surviving children and said very calmly, "Now we don't have to pretend to forgive anyone." Margaret was 14 years old, and she'd just learned that truces were lies, mercy was weakness, and the only rule that mattered was winning. Within 3 months, her brother Edward would prove he'd learned the same lessons. The Battle of Towton, fought in a blinding snowstorm on Palm Sunday 1461, was less battle than butchery. 28,000 men died in a single day. The snow was so thick soldiers couldn't tell friend from foe, so they just killed everyone. The Lancastrians broke first, tried to flee across the Cockbeck River, but the bridge collapsed under the weight of panicking men. They drowned by the hundreds, their bodies damming the river until men could walk across on corpses. Edward didn't just win, he annihilated. Every captured Lancastrian noble was executed on the spot. No trials, no mercy, no exchanges. When local priests complained about executing men on Palm Sunday, Edward replied that Christ had died to forgive sins, so he was just sending them to collect their forgiveness personally. He was 18 years old, 6'4", golden-haired, and covered in so much blood that witnesses couldn't tell what colour his armour had been. By sunset on Palm Sunday, Edward of York was functionally King of England. The former king, Henry VI, had fled to Scotland. Margaret of Anjou had escaped to France with her son. The Lancastrian cause was broken, scattered, leaderless. London opened its gates to Edward without resistance. On June 28, 1461, he was crowned King Edward IV in Westminster Abbey. Margaret watched her brother's coronation from the best seat in the cathedral. She was 15, wearing a dress that cost more than most knights' annual income, trying not to think about how it was paid for with dead men's gold. The same nobles who'd laughed at her mother's begging now knelt before her brother. The same bishops who'd called them cursed now proclaimed them blessed. The same merchants who'd refused them credit now offered unlimited loans. But Margaret wasn't celebrating. She was studying, watching how quickly loyalty shifted, how easily oaths were broken and remade, how the difference between traitor and hero was just who won the last battle. She saw her brother George, now Duke of Clarence, already looking petulant that he wasn't closer to the throne. Saw their youngest brother Richard, just 9 years old, standing perfectly still for the entire 3-hour ceremony, already showing the self-control that would make him dangerous. During the coronation feast, Margaret overheard 2 Lancastrian widows, women whose husbands had died at Towton, discussing whether Edward would marry their daughters. The bodies weren't even buried, and they were already planning how to join the winning side. That's when Margaret understood that victory wasn't about defeating your enemies. It was about making them betray themselves to join you, making their survival depend on your success. Edward took to kingship like he'd been born for it, which, according to their family's version of history, he had been. He was brilliant at being king in public, charming, generous, magnificently royal. Women loved him, and he loved them back, enthusiastically and often. Men admired him even when he was seducing their wives. He could drink anyone under the table, then wake up fresh and ready to govern. He made being king look easy, which was its own kind of genius. But Margaret saw what others missed: the way Edward's hands shook after signing death warrants, how he drank more after executions, the nightmares that made him cry out for Edmund. The crown was heavy, and Edward carried it by pretending it weighed nothing. He buried his grief under feast after feast, woman after woman, victory after victory. But grief doesn't go away just because you ignore it. It just ferments into something more dangerous. The marriage question started immediately. Every unmarried princess in Europe was suddenly available. The King of France offered his sister. The Duke of Burgundy hinted about alliances. Spanish princesses, Scottish princesses, German princesses. The offers poured in like wedding invitations to a feast of power. Edward entertained them all, made promises to none, and secretly married a widow named Elizabeth Woodville in a ceremony so private that only the priest and 2 witnesses knew about it for months. When Edward finally announced his marriage, the court exploded. Elizabeth Woodville wasn't foreign royalty who could bring alliances. She wasn't even noble. Her father was a mere knight. Worse, she was a Lancastrian widow with 2 sons from her previous marriage. She was beautiful, yes, but beauty didn't bring armies or trade agreements. The marriage was personal, emotional, romantic, everything a royal marriage shouldn't be. Margaret understood before anyone else what this meant. Edward had just declared that he'd make decisions based on what he wanted, not what the kingdom needed. It was simultaneously admirable and catastrophic. A king who followed his heart was a king who could be led by it. And Elizabeth Woodville, with her blonde hair and grey eyes and perfect smile, had just proven she could lead Edward anywhere she wanted. The Woodvilles descended on court like locusts in silk. Elizabeth had 5 brothers and 7 sisters, all of whom suddenly needed titles, marriages and positions. Within 2 years, the Woodvilles controlled more of the English government than families who'd been noble for centuries. They were everywhere, in the treasury, the military, the church. Elizabeth's father, who'd been nobody, was now Earl Rivers. Her 20-year-old brother John married the Duchess of Norfolk, who was 65 and one of the richest women in England. It was shameless, spectacular, and completely legal. Margaret watched this invasion with fascination and disgust, not because she cared about bloodline purity. That was a game for people who didn't understand real power, but because she saw how it fractured Edward's support. The Earl of Warwick, who'd helped put Edward on the throne, was furious. George of Clarence, already jealous of Edward, now had the Woodvilles to hate too. The nobility who'd fought for York were being displaced by upstarts who'd fought against them. This was when Margaret learned another crucial lesson. Victory creates more enemies than defeat. When you lose, your enemies feel safe ignoring you. When you win, everyone who helped you win thinks they deserve more than they got. Edward had united the nobility against the Lancastrians. Now, without that common enemy, they were turning on each other. Margaret's own position was precarious but powerful. As the king's sister, she was the most valuable, unmarried woman in England. Every conversation was a negotiation for her future. Every smile was analysed for preference. Every dance was a diplomatic mission. She couldn't show favour to anyone without starting rumours, couldn't refuse anyone without causing offence. She existed in perfect paralysing balance. The marriage negotiations for Margaret started in earnest in 1465. She was 19, past the usual age for a first marriage, but her value had only increased with age and Edward's crown. The Duke of Burgundy wanted her for his heir, Charles the Bold. The King of France wanted her for anyone who wasn't Charles the Bold. Scotland made offers, Portugal sent portraits, even the Holy Roman Emperor expressed interest, though that may have just been to annoy France. Margaret preferred Burgundy, not because she had any romantic notions about Charles. She'd heard enough about his temper to know better. But Burgundy was rich, powerful, and most importantly, far enough from England to give her independence, but close enough to maintain influence. Plus, Burgundy controlled the wool trade, and English prosperity depended on wool. A marriage alliance would secure both economies. But Edward hesitated. For 3 years he hesitated, not because he didn't want the Burgundian alliance, but because he was playing France and Burgundy against each other, trying to get the best deal. Meanwhile, Margaret aged 20, 21, 22. In medieval terms, she was approaching spinsterhood. Younger princesses were entering the marriage market. Her value was starting to depreciate. Margaret didn't wait passively. She learned everything about Burgundy, its politics, economics, culture, conflicts. She studied Charles's first wife, Isabella of Bourbon, who died mysteriously after 8 years of marriage. She memorized Burgundian court etiquette, learned their dialect of French, studied their trade routes. If she was going to be sold to Burgundy, she'd arrive as an asset, not a burden. She also built her own network, ladies in waiting who were really informants, merchants who carried her letters along with their goods, priests who heard confessions and reported interesting sins. By the time she left for Burgundy, she had eyes and ears in every major English town. Edward thought he was sending away a sister. He was actually deploying a spy. The wedding finally happened in 1468, but the journey to get there was its own kind of war. The French did everything to stop it. They sent ships to intercept Margaret's crossing. They spread rumours that Charles was impotent, insane, or already secretly married. They even tried to kidnap Margaret during her journey to Dover, though that plot was discovered when one of the conspirators got drunk and bragged to one of Margaret's ladies, who was actually one of her informants in a dress. Margaret's departure from England was grand theatre. She rode through London on a white horse, wearing cloth of gold that caught the sun like armour. The streets were lined with citizens throwing roses, white roses for York. Poets composed verses comparing her to Helen of Troy, though Margaret probably preferred the comparison to Penelope, the woman who waited and wove and survived. At Dover, Edward came to say goodbye. They stood on the dock, brother and sister, king and princess, and for once dropped the performance. Edward gave her a ring. Not ceremonial, just a simple gold band that had belonged to their father. "Remember us," he said. Margaret wanted to say she could never forget, that every breath she took in Burgundy would be for York. Instead she said, "Rule wisely." They both knew he wouldn't. The crossing to Burgundy was smooth, which everyone took as a good omen. Margaret spent it practicing her wedding vows in Dutch, the language of her new subjects. She also spent it burning letters, correspondence too dangerous to leave behind, but too valuable to forget. She memorized every word before feeding them to the flames, names of English nobles who could be turned, amounts of French bribes, the location of 3 illegitimate children Edward didn't know anyone knew about. She landed at Sluys to crowds and cannon fire. The Burgundians had turned out in force to see their new Duchess. Charles wasn't there, he was too important to meet boats, but his representatives were. They'd brought a crown for her to wear during the entry parade. It was heavier than she expected, made of gold and rubies that caught the light like drops of blood. The moment they placed it on her head, Margaret of York ceased to exist. She was now Margaret of Burgundy, but York never really left her blood. It just learned to speak Dutch. The wedding itself was the most expensive party Europe had seen in a century. It made Edward's coronation look like a country feast. 9 days of celebrations that nearly bankrupted 3 cities. Bruges alone spent enough on decorations to fund a small war. Wine fountains ran red and white in every square. Merchants gave away free cloth to anyone wearing white roses. Margaret's tribute to her heritage that Charles pretended not to notice. The banquet was insanity dressed in silk. A 60-foot tower made of pastry that opened to release live songbirds. Ships on wheels rolled through the hall, while actors dressed as Jason and the Argonauts fought mechanical dragons. An enormous pie that broke open to reveal 24 musicians playing inside. Dwarfs jousted on pigs, while giants served wine from barrels strapped to their backs. At one point, a live lion was brought in wearing a collar of diamonds, because Charles wanted to prove he could make apex predators wear jewellery. But the real spectacle was Margaret herself. She had to be perfect, foreign enough to be exotic, familiar enough to be trusted. She spoke her vows in flawless Dutch, then switched to French for the blessing, then Latin for the prayers. When Burgundian nobles tested her with barbed comments about English barbarism, she laughed and said their wine was almost as good as English ale, implying both cultures had their strengths. When a French ambassador accidentally called her the sister of the usurper, she smiled sweetly and said she was just a simple bride, too overwhelmed by Burgundian generosity to understand politics. Charles himself was exactly what she'd expected. 40 years old to her 22, handsome in a harsh way, with eyes that calculated the value of everything they saw. He collected books and territories with equal obsession. He could quote Aristotle in Greek and order a city burned in the same breath. He wore a hair shirt under his cloth of gold robes, pain and luxury combined, which basically summarized his entire personality. Their wedding night was political theatre performed before an audience. The court literally watched them get into bed together. Nobles stood around the marriage bed, while priests blessed the sheets, and Margaret's mother-in-law made jokes about hoping for a grandson by morning. The curtains were drawn for exactly 1 hour, while the court waited outside. Some claimed they heard Margaret cry out. Others said there was only silence. When the curtains opened, Charles emerged to announce the marriage was consummated. Margaret stayed in bed, staring at the canopy, calculating how to turn this humiliation into power. But here's what those watching courtiers missed. After they left, Charles returned to the bed and talked to Margaret for 3 more hours. Not about love or desire, about England, about which French nobles could be bought, about Hanseatic trade routes, about how long Edward could hold his throne, with the Woodvilles making everyone angry. This wasn't a marriage, it was a merger. 2 brilliant, cold people recognising each other as useful tools. Margaret threw herself into her new role with terrifying efficiency. Within 6 months, she'd reorganised the Duchess's household, cutting expenses by 30%, while somehow making it look more luxurious. She renegotiated trade agreements that tripled English wool imports. She established a court that rivaled Paris for the culture and sophistication. She became Charles's most trusted advisor on English affairs, which meant she read every letter between Burgundy and England before anyone else. She also built her own power base. She patronised artists, creating a cultural renaissance that made Burgundy the envy of Europe. She commissioned illuminated manuscripts that cost more than castles. She brought English musicians to teach Burgundian composers and Burgundian painters to capture English styles. Every artwork was propaganda, showing the glory of Burgundy with subtle white roses worked into the borders. But her real achievement was intelligence. Margaret created the most sophisticated spy network in Northern Europe. Every English merchant in Burgundy reported to her. Every travelling priest carried her messages. She had servants in the French court who memorised conversations, bankers who tracked suspicious payments, nuns who read letters meant for other eyes. Within a year, She knew more about European politics than most kings. The network ran on favours and fear in equal measure. Help Margaret, and your trade routes were protected, your loans approved, your daughters married well. Cross her and your ships mysteriously sank. Your credit dried up. Your sons died in unfortunate accidents that definitely weren't assassinations, because duchesses didn't do such things. She never threatened anyone directly. She just made sure people understood that Burgundy could be a very dangerous place for those who didn't appreciate their duchess. Then in 1470, everything changed. The warning came in a coded letter from one of her informants in London. Edward was in trouble. Real trouble. The Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker who'd helped put Edward on the throne, had finally had enough of the Woodvilles. He'd allied with the one person nobody expected, George of Clarence. Margaret's own brother, that perpetual disappointment, that wine-soaked fool, had betrayed Edward for the promise of a crown. The coup was brilliant in its simplicity. While Edward was in the north dealing with a rebellion Warwick had secretly orchestrated, Warwick and Clarence landed in the south with an army. They declared Edward a false king, claiming his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, his children bastards. The nobility, sick of the Woodvilles' greed, didn't resist. London opened its gates. Edward had to run for his life, barely escaping to the coast with about 700 loyal men. He sailed for Burgundy because he had nowhere else to go. France would have executed him. Scotland would have sold him. Only Margaret could save him, and even that wasn't certain. Charles's advisors immediately suggested turning Edward away. Harbouring a deposed king would anger France, disrupt trade, possibly start a war. It was the smart move, the safe move. Margaret listened to their arguments for 3 hours. Then she spoke for 10 minutes. By the end, Charles had pledged 50,000 crowns and a fleet to restore Edward to his throne. How did she do it? Simple. She reminded Charles that a Lancastrian England would ally with France. Burgundy would be surrounded. But more than that, she played to his vanity. Imagine being the duke who restored a king. Imagine England's eternal gratitude. Imagine the power that would give Burgundy over English trade. Edward arrived at the Burgundian court like a ghost of his former glory. The golden giant who'd taken the throne at 18 was now a desperate exile at 28. He'd gained weight from too much wine and too many banquets. His famous charm felt forced. He jumped at sudden noises. A man who'd learned that brothers could betray you between dinner and dessert. Margaret hadn't seen him in 3 years. When they met in Charles's great hall, with half the Burgundian court watching, she was supposed to curtsy to him. He still claimed to be king. Instead, she walked straight to him and whispered something in his ear. Whatever she said made him laugh, really laugh, for the first time since his exile. Some witnesses claimed she said, "You look terrible." Others insisted it was, "George was always an idiot." Margaret never told anyone what she really said. The three of them, Margaret, Edward and Charles, spent Christmas 1470 planning invasion. While the rest of the court feasted on swan and drank themselves stupid, they were in Charles's study, maps spread across every surface. Margaret was the one who suggested landing in the north, where Edward still had loyalty. She was the one who pointed out that Clarence was already regretting his choice. His wife was Isabel Neville, Warwick's daughter, but she was also Margaret's sister-in-law, and family ties might be exploited. She was right. When Edward landed at Ravenspur in March 1471, with just 2,000 men, Clarence was waiting, not to fight him, but to join him. The brothers embraced in the mud, Clarence weeping, Edward forgiving. It was touching. It was also tactical. Edward needed every sword he could get, even held by treacherous hands. What followed was the bloodiest spring in English history. The Battle of Barnet, fought in fog so thick that men killed their allies because they couldn't see badges in the mist. Warwick, the kingmaker, died trying to reach his horse, cut down in confusion. Then Tewkesbury, where the 17-year-old Lancastrian Prince of Wales was butchered despite crying for mercy. Some say Edward killed him personally. Others say it was Clarence, trying to prove his new loyalty. Or maybe it was Richard, just 18 but already earning his reputation for necessary violence. Margaret got the news in Bruges. Edward was king again. The Lancastrian line was essentially extinct. Mad King Henry would die, mysteriously, in the Tower within days. Melancholy, they'd call it. The kind that left bruises shaped like hands around your throat. The Wars of the Roses were over. York had won. Her brothers controlled England, absolutely. But Margaret knew better than to celebrate. Victory was just another word for until next time. And she was right, because Edward, drunk on victory and grateful for survival, had just made the stupidest decision of his reign. He'd forgiven Clarence completely, given him back his lands, titles, position, invited the traitor back to the heart of power. Margaret wrote letter after letter warning Edward. A man who betrayed once would betray again. Weakness and greed were a fatal combination, and Clarence had both in abundance. But Edward believed in the power of charm and forgiveness. He thought love could overcome ambition. He thought brothers were bound by blood. Margaret knew better. Blood was just another liquid that could be spilled for power. The next few years were deceptively peaceful. Edward ruled, the Woodvilles grabbed, Clarence sulked, and Margaret watched from Burgundy as her family played out a tragedy anyone could see coming except them. She kept her spy network active, her correspondence constant, her warnings ignored. Every letter from England carried the same news dressed in different words. Everything was fine until it wouldn't be. Charles, meanwhile, had decided to become Charlemagne, or Alexander, or whoever would let him wear a crown instead of a ducal coronet. He wanted to unite all his territories into a kingdom, which meant conquering everything between them. First Lorraine, easy enough, barely a real fight. Then the Swiss cantons. The Swiss, mountain people who'd been killing invaders since Rome and had gotten very, very good at it. Margaret tried to warn him. She'd studied military history while other duchesses studied poetry. She knew the Swiss had perfected pike squares that could shred cavalry charges. She knew they fought with democratic fury. Free men defending their freedom hit different than conscripts defending their lord's ambitions. She presented Charles with detailed analyses of Swiss tactics, terrain advantages, supply line vulnerabilities. He patted her hand and told her to stick to trade negotiations. January 5th, 1477. The Battle of Nancy. Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, the man who would be king, led the finest army in Europe against Swiss peasants and lost everything. They found his body 3 days later, face down in a frozen pond, skull split open, naked because even his corpse had been looted. The richest duke in Europe died bare-assed in a ditch, picked clean by mountain men who didn't care about his dreams of empire. Margaret got the news while reviewing wool shipments. They say she didn't cry, didn't scream, just carefully set down her quill, dismissed everyone, and sat in silence for 3 hours. When she emerged, she'd already written 18 letters, orders, plans, contingencies. Because while everyone else was mourning or celebrating Charles's death, Margaret was calculating what it meant for the elaborate chess game she'd been playing for 9 years. Charles left behind a 20-year-old daughter, Mary, unmarried, vulnerable, the richest heiress in Europe, with every wolf on the continent racing to claim her. Within hours of Charles's death, Louis XV of France, the Spider King, was mobilizing armies. The Holy Roman Emperor was making similar plans. Every unmarried prince in Europe was already on the road to Burgundy. Margaret took control. Not officially, she had no legal right, but in chaos, competence looks like authority. She fortified the borders with her personal funds. She paid the armies back wages to keep them from deserting or, worse, switching sides. She negotiated temporary truces with enemies who thought a widow and an orphan would be easy prey. Most importantly, she took Mary under her protection. The girl was paralysed, her father dead, armies marching toward her, every advisor pushing different suitors for their own benefit. Margaret was the only one Mary could trust. the only one without a son to push forward or a brother to advocate for. The solution was marriage, obviously, but to whom? Louis XV wanted Mary to marry his 7-year-old son, essentially making Burgundy French in everything but name. The English ambassadors, smelling opportunity, suggested one of Margaret's brothers, even Clarence, because apparently fraternal betrayal and spectacular incompetence weren't deal-breakers in royal marriage negotiations. Margaret orchestrated Mary's choice, Maximilian of Habsburg, not because she loved the Habsburgs, but because they were far enough away to let Burgundy maintain independence, strong enough to fight France, and most importantly, ambitious enough to be manipulated. The wedding happened so fast Maximilian arrived still dusty from hard riding. Within a year, Mary was pregnant. Within 3 years, she was dead, thrown from her horse while hunting, spine shattered, dying in agony while begging Margaret to protect her children. And just like that, Margaret was no longer a duchess. She was a dowager, a widow without children of her own, her stepdaughter dead, her step-grandchildren Habsburg property. Technically, she should have retired to a convent. That's what childless widows did. They disappeared gracefully into irrelevance and prayer. Instead, Margaret negotiated herself a dower portion, lands and incomes that would support her independently. She established herself at Mechlin, turning it into her own miniature court, and she began playing a much longer, much darker game. Because while she'd been managing Burgundy's collapse, something unforgivable had happened in England. April 9th, 1483, Edward IV died. He was only 40. They said it was fever, or poison, or too much wine, and women finally collecting their debt. Nobody knew for sure, but Margaret knew what it meant. Edward's heir was 12-year-old Edward V, a child king in a kingdom that ate children alive. The news reached Margaret in fragments. First that Edward was ill, then that he was dying, then that he was dead, then that everything was falling apart faster than anyone could track. Richard, their youngest brother, quiet Richard, loyal Richard, Richard, who'd stood by Edward through every battle, had been named Lord Protector. Good, sensible. The boy needed guidance. Then came the next letter. Richard had declared Edward's marriage invalid. All his children were bastards. Something about a pre-contract with another woman, conveniently revealed only after Edward was too dead to dispute it. Then the next letter. Richard had taken the throne. The 2 princes, Edward V and his younger brother, were in the Tower for their protection. Then the final letter. The princes hadn't been seen for weeks. They were gone. No bodies, no funeral, no explanation. Just 2 boys who walked into the Tower and never walked out. Margaret read this last letter 3 times. Then she burned it. Then she sat at her desk and began writing a different kind of letter. Not to Richard, what was the point? He'd already chosen his path. Not to the English nobles, they'd already bent the knee, but to every enemy England had ever made. Every exile, every dispossessed heir, every ambitious second son, looking for a cause. Because Margaret had just made a decision. If Richard could steal the throne by declaring children bastards, if he could murder boys whose only crime was their birth, then the game had no rules anymore. And if the game had no rules, Margaret was going to play it her way. She could have accepted it. Richard was still her brother. He even wrote to her explaining his actions. Necessity, stability. The boys were Edward's mistakes, not York blood. Politics required hard choices. Family was family. She could have stayed quiet, stayed safe, stayed irrelevant. Instead, Margaret decided to destroy everything. Not immediately. Margaret was too smart for hot revenge. She waited. She gathered information. Richard's reign was already shaky. The nobility didn't trust child killers, even when they benefited from the killing. The common people whispered about the princes. Richard's own wife, Anne Neville, was dying, and rumours said he planned to marry Elizabeth of York, his own niece, Edward's daughter, to solidify his claim. Even medieval standards had standards, and that crossed them. Then came Henry Tudor. A nobody, really. A quarter Welsh exile with a claim to the throne so weak it was almost funny. Through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, who descended from John of Gaunt's bastard line that had been legitimised but specifically barred from the throne. He'd been hiding in Brittany for 14 years, so insignificant that Edward had stopped bothering to have him assassinated. But Henry had one thing Richard didn't: clean hands. He hadn't betrayed anyone because he'd never been close enough to power to have the opportunity. He hadn't murdered nephews because he didn't have any. He was a blank slate that desperate people could project their hopes onto. Margaret didn't support Henry Tudor because she believed in him. She supported him because he was a weapon aimed at Richard's throat. Every coin she sent to Brittany, every mercenary she hired, every letter she wrote to disaffected Yorkists. It was all designed to hurt Richard. To make him feel what those boys must have felt in the Tower. Alone. Betrayed. Terrified. August 22nd, 1485, Bosworth Field. Richard died screaming for a horse, abandoned by half his army, hacked to pieces in a muddy field. They stripped his corpse naked, slung it over a horse like butchered meat, paraded it through Leicester. The last Plantagenet king of England died like a common criminal. Henry Tudor picked the crown out of the mud, put it on his head, and became Henry VII. Margaret got the news in September. Both her brothers dead. Edward, poisoned or exhausted. Richard, butchered. The boys she'd grown up with, plotted with, loved despite everything, gone. The York dynasty was finished. And the man wearing the crown, the son of Margaret Beaufort, a woman Margaret had known at court, a woman who'd smiled to her face while planning her family's destruction for 20 years. The sensible thing would be to accept defeat. She was 40 years old, widowed in a foreign country. Her family was dead or scattered. Henry Tudor had won. He'd even married her niece, Elizabeth of York, uniting the two roses. The wars were over. Time to retire gracefully. Margaret started recruiting assassins, but not obviously. First, she grieved publicly, wore black for a full year, commissioned masses for her brothers' souls, sent a polite letter of congratulation to Henry and Elizabeth on their marriage. She was the perfect image of a defeated woman accepting God's will. Henry's spies, and he had many, reported that the Duchess of Burgundy had accepted the new order. Meanwhile, Margaret was building something beautiful, a factory for fake princes. She found the first one in Ireland, a 10-year-old boy named Lambert Simnel. Blonde, delicate features, the right age to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, Clarence's son, one of the last male Yorks. Never mind that the real Edward was locked in the Tower. Details like truth had never stopped anyone before. A priest named Richard Simon had been training the boy, teaching him to walk like a prince, talk like a prince, wave like a prince. Margaret didn't believe for a second this child was her nephew, but she threw her full support behind him anyway. Money, 2,000 German Landsknechts, letters to every Yorkist exile dreaming of restoration. May 1487, they crowned Lambert Simnel as King Edward VI in Dublin Cathedral. The Archbishop performed the ceremony with absolute seriousness, probably because Margaret was paying him enough to buy his own cathedral. Ireland didn't care if the boy was real. Ireland hated England, and they'd crown a sheep if it annoyed the English. June 16th, 1487, the Battle of Stokefield, the last battle of the Wars of the Roses, though nobody knew it yet. Lincoln, Margaret's actual nephew, the one who might have had a real claim, led the invasion. He died on the field with a sword in his hand, the last York prince to die fighting for the throne. The Landsknechts fought to the last man, because that's what they were paid to do. The Irish were slaughtered trying to fight knights with farming tools. Lambert Simnel, Henry captured him alive, but instead of executing him, Henry did something brilliant. He made the boy a kitchen servant, a child who'd been crowned king, now turning spits in Henry's kitchen. Every feast, there was the pretender, serving soup to lords who'd once knelt before him. The humiliation was art. The message was clear. Margaret's threats were so pathetic, he could afford to keep them as pets. But Margaret had learned from the failure. Next time, she needed someone better, older, more convincing, someone who could play a prince rather than just wear the clothes. She found him in Tournai, 17 years old, beautiful in that dangerous way that made people want to believe impossible things. They called him Perkin Warbeck, though that probably wasn't his real name. His official story, he was Richard, Duke of York, the younger prince from the Tower. He'd escaped murder, been smuggled to Flanders, raised in secret. Now he was ready to claim his throne. It was nonsense, but Perkin could cry on cue when talking about his murdered brother. He could describe palace rooms he'd never seen with perfect accuracy, because Margaret had trained him for 2 years, feeding him her memories until he believed them himself. She taught him how Edward laughed, how the palace at Westminster smelled after rain, the pet names the family used, details only an insider would know. By 1492, Perkin Warbeck had the backing of the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of France, and James IV of Scotland, who liked him so much he gave Perkin his cousin in marriage, Lady Catherine Gordon, a woman far too good for a fake prince. They toured Europe like celebrities, the Duke of York and his Scottish princess, in exile but unbowed. Henry Tudor was so paranoid he started executing people for saying Perkin was handsome. That's how much this bothered him. Every blonde boy was suddenly suspicious. Every ship from Burgundy might carry invasion. Every Yorkist gathering was potential treason. Henry created a spy network that would make modern intelligence agencies jealous, all because Margaret had put a beautiful boy in silk and called him a prince. The invasions failed, of course. 1495 in Kent, the locals threw rocks. 1496 from Scotland, barely a raid. 1497 in Cornwall, he actually raised an army, declared himself Richard IV, marched on Exeter. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like Margaret's beautiful fraud might actually work. It didn't. Henry's forces surrounded Perkin at Beaulieu Abbey. He surrendered, probably weeping. He was good at that. Henry kept him as a trophy for 2 years, like he'd done with Simnel, made him confess publicly, kept him at court as a living reminder of Margaret's failures. But Perkin couldn't help himself. He tried to escape. Twice. After the second attempt, Henry had him hanged at Tyburn. November 23rd, 1499. They said he confessed again on the scaffold, but his last words were in Dutch, the language Margaret had taught him. Margaret never commented publicly on Perkin's death. By then she had a new strategy. If she couldn't destroy Henry with princes, she'd destroy him with paranoia, and it worked beautifully. Henry became the most paranoid king England ever had. He created the Court of Star Chamber, a secret court where he could try nobles without juries or evidence. He kept detailed files on every noble family, tracking marriages, debts, alliances, grudges. He taxed the nobility into poverty, reasoning that poor lords couldn't afford rebellions. He trusted no one, not his wife, not his mother, not even his own sons. Margaret had turned the King of England into a prisoner in his own castle. He slept badly, aged rapidly, became miserly and cruel. His own courtiers called him the Winter King, cold, suspicious, joyless. He'd won the throne, but Margaret had made sure he'd never enjoy it. The joke was, by 1500, Margaret had mostly stopped trying. She was in her 50s, tired, and frankly, running out of money. But Henry didn't know that. He kept seeing her shadows everywhere. When a merchant mentioned Burgundy, Henry heard conspiracy. When a blonde child was born to Yorkist parents, Henry wondered if they were preparing another pretender. She corresponded with her niece, Elizabeth of York, Henry's own queen. Innocent letters about family, health, the weather. But Henry read them all, analysed every word, convinced they contained codes. They didn't. Margaret just enjoyed knowing that the Queen of England needed her husband's permission to write to her own aunt. In her final years, Margaret became something of a legend, the last York. the diabolical Duchess. Young Yorkist exiles would make pilgrimages to Mechlin just to see her. She'd receive them in halls decorated with white roses and portraits of her dead brothers. She'd tell stories about Edward's glory days, carefully avoiding Richard's crimes. She'd give them small gifts, a ring, a book, enough money to survive another year in exile. Then she'd send them away, these boys who dreamed of revolution, knowing they'd never achieve it, but letting them hope anyway. She commissioned books, gorgeous manuscripts that cost more than most people's houses. But look carefully at the illustrations, and you'd see little revenges. Trojan princes who looked like Edward IV, villains with Henry Tudor's narrow face, dragons wearing Tudor green getting slain by knights carrying white roses. By 1503, Margaret was dying, probably cancer, though medieval physicians just called it a growth in her woman's parts. She was in constant pain, taking opium wine just to sleep. But she kept writing letters, even as her hands shook, even as the pain made her vision blur, to Scotland, to Spain, to every Yorkist exile who might, somehow, someday, make Henry Tudor suffer just a little bit more. Her last letter was to Henry himself. Nobody knows what it said. Henry burned it immediately, then locked himself in his chambers for 3 days. But his courtiers noticed something. After reading Margaret's letter, Henry never slept soundly again. He'd wake screaming about white roses growing from his chest. He'd see Edward IV's face in mirrors. He became convinced his own son, Prince Henry, was plotting against him. Margaret of York died on November 23rd, 1503. The exact same date Perkin Warbeck had been hanged 4 years earlier. Maybe coincidence, maybe she'd been holding on, waiting for that anniversary. She died at night, clutching a white rose badge, smiling, the kind of smile that suggested she knew something nobody else did. They buried her in the Franciscan church in Mechlin. Simple black marble, no effigy, just her name and titles. Duchess of Burgundy, sister to King Edward IV. Nothing about the 23 years she'd spent trying to destroy the Tudor dynasty. Nothing about the fake princes, the failed invasions, the successful campaign of psychological warfare. Just a woman's name and a dignity that couldn't be taken away. Henry Tudor lived 6 more years after Margaret's death. 6 years of increasing paranoia, failing health, and absolute certainty that somewhere, somehow, Margaret's last plot was still unfolding. He died in 1509, rich but miserable, powerful but sleepless. They say his last words were, "The roses, the white roses," but that might just be Tudor propaganda in reverse. Here's the truth. Margaret of York lost every battle she fought. The Tudors ruled England for over a century. Her pretenders are remembered as jokes: Lambert Simnel, the kitchen boy, Perkin Warbeck, the beautiful fraud. Nobody names their daughters after Margaret of York. She's the villain in every Tudor historian's narrative, when they remember her at all. But she also won in the way that mattered most. She made Henry VII's victory worthless. What good is winning a throne if you can never sit comfortably on it? What good is defeating your enemies if their ghosts keep you awake? She turned winning into its own kind of losing. She made Henry's crown a prison, his palace a trap, his mind a torture chamber. She proved that a woman with no army, no kingdom, and no legitimate claim could make the King of England afraid of his own shadow. She proved that revenge didn't require success. It just required persistence. She proved that sometimes the best way to destroy your enemies is to let them win. Then spend the rest of their lives wondering when you're going to take it all away. Every pretender who claimed the English throne for the next 200 years invoked Margaret's name. Not because she succeeded, but because she never stopped trying. She became the patron saint of lost causes, the goddess of expensive revenge. When the Jacobites toasted the king over the water, they were following Margaret's playbook. When governments in exile plot restoration, they're walking paths Margaret carved with pure spite. But the real legacy isn't political, it's personal. Margaret of York proved that sometimes the only response to injustice is unreasonable, unsustainable, absolute refusal to accept it. She proved that one person's obsession can shake kingdoms. She proved that even when you lose, especially when you lose, you can still make winning cost more than anyone wanted to pay. In the end, Margaret didn't get justice for her murdered nephews. She didn't restore the York dynasty. She didn't even get to see Henry Tudor die. But she did something better. She made sure he never, not for one single day of his reign, felt safe. She turned his victory into a life sentence of fear. She made him understand that crowns stolen in blood would always feel too heavy, fit too loose, shine too dim, and that smile on her deathbed. Maybe she was thinking about Henry reading her last letter. Maybe she was imagining his face when the next blonde boy showed up claiming to be a lost prince. Or maybe she just enjoyed knowing that somewhere in Westminster Palace, the King of England was sleeping badly, dreaming of white roses growing from his chest, wondering if death was really enough to stop Margaret of York. It wasn't. Some ghosts don't need to be real to haunt you. They just need you to believe they might be. And Margaret of York? She made absolutely certain Henry Tudor would believe, until his dying breath. That's not losing. That's winning the only game that actually mattered. The one played in your enemy's mind. Margaret of York died believing she'd failed. History says she failed. But every night, Henry Tudor woke up screaming. That was Margaret winning. Every rival he executed out of paranoia, Margaret winning. Every tax he levied to fund his spy network, Margaret winning. She lost every battle, but won the war for Henry's sanity, and she won it so thoroughly that he never even knew he was fighting it. Now that's revenge. Not the kind that conquers kingdoms, but the kind that conquers sleep. The kind that turns victory into its own punishment. The kind that makes you wonder, in those dark hours before dawn, if somewhere in Mechlin, a dead woman is still smiling. Because in the end, Margaret of York understood something most people never learn. Power isn't about winning. It's about making your enemies realise that winning and losing are just different kinds of suffering. And nobody ever made that point quite like the woman they called the Diabolical Duchess, the architect of anxiety. The last York, standing even after she fell. She lost everything, and somehow, in losing, she won the only victory that ever really mattered. She made the winners wish they'd lost instead.